excited for our presentation today on navigating non-suicidal self-injury with families, clinical insight into self-injury, youth needs, and caregiver support. Um, Really delighted to join. We're going to get started in just a minute. This is a note from CTAC that it's provided with all the information today is illustrative and descriptive purposes only. So I'm delighted to introduce you to today's presenter, Dr. Janice Whitlock. She is a research scientist, developmental psychologist, and public health specialist, specializing in advanced understanding of and support for adolescent and young adult mental health and well-being. She is the founder and director of the Cornell Research Program on Self-Injury and Recovery, which was established in 2003 to enhance understanding of NSSI. She also additionally served as the associate director of the Bronfenbrenner Center for Translational Research at Cornell. And she continues to contribute there as an emeritus research scientist and senior lecturer. She's the author of over 50 publications on non-suicidal self-injury in adolescence and young adulthood, also on social media and mental health, and in youth connectedness to schools and communities, and is also the author of the book Healing Self-Injury, A Compassionate Guide for Parents and Other Loved Ones. Dr. Whitlock, welcome today, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jackie, and thank you to everybody for being here. Just do this. Okay, so today we'll be talking primarily, we're going to kind of span the gamut here. We're going to talk a little bit about NSSI epidemiology and function, but mostly I want to focus on caregivers. So that will be the lens through which a lot of my extraneous comments are offered. We'll be covering, in addition to that, a little bit on detection and intervention and some resource sharing, and then we'll have some time at the end for a Q&A. Learning objectives for today are basically to identify key features of self-injury epidemiology and vectors for contagion, although we're not going to be talking a ton about vectors for contagion. I probably should have modified that, but I'll mention it. We just don't have a lot of time to go into that, into a lot of detail, except to say that it does happen. We'll understand core principles and practices in effective detection and intervention, and we'll learn strategies for supporting caregivers to youth living with NSSI. And then lastly, I'll share some useful NSSI resources in terms of articles, books, and websites. So remember to take care of yourselves. I know we're all on Zoom. It's much easier than if we were not, but I always just want to, I don't think there's anything in here that should be overtly triggering, but please just do step away when and if you need to do that. You did hear a little bit about me. This is just a slide to demonstrate some of the stuff that I do. I do a lot of work in non-suicidal self-injury. I was at Cornell for 22 years. And during that time, did a lot in self-injury, suicide prevention, connectedness and resilience, and social media and mental health. I retired in 2022. I was also the founding director or the founder of the International Society for the Study of Self-Injury. It grew out of a meeting that we had in 2006 at Cornell. I basically looked around and said, who's doing any work in this area? Back in 2006, it was pretty unusual. There just weren't a lot of people doing research. And so I think we've identified 22 people around the world, and 17 of them came, and then that grew into ISSS, which is still going on today. And then I do have the Cornell Research Program on Self-Injury and Recovery. It's the Self-Injury and Recovery Resources website. So I will talk about that because we have tons of downloadables and free resources on that website. I was not always an academic. I was worked in the field for 12 years before I went back for a PhD in the late 90s. And I worked in women's health and youth mental health and well-being broadly conceived. And so it is from that vantage point, from the perspective of a practitioner, that all of my research was conducted. And it's really important to me that it gets out into the world in terms of knowledge to the people who can use it to make the biggest difference, which is you. You guys are the most important people in the world. So I retired in 2022 so that I could more actively be involved in the knowledge translation component, because if it doesn't get into the hands of what we're learning, doesn't get into the hands of people like you and families and people who work in youth serving systems, then, what's the point of doing it, was my logic. So that is really what I do now. And I don't have a website up yet, working on that, but the stuff down at the bottom is an access to my business card. So if you want to get in touch with me about other resources, please do. All right, non-suicidal self-injury, just for a little bit of background. I know this, we're going to focus largely on families, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of just what this phenomenon is defined as the deliberate, direct, and self-inflicted destruction of body tissue resulting in immediate tissue damage for purposes not socially sanctioned and without suicidal intent. Believe it or not, it took us about 6 months to come up with this definition. Partly that's because when we were all talking about it back in 2006, we all being the researchers that gathered for that meeting at Cornell I mentioned, we it wasn't clearly differentiated from suicide. So a lot of the concepts that we had around this were coming from the UK. That was self-harm broadly conceived. It didn't separate out intent, but it was starting to become very clear in 2006 that there was a phenomenon that we didn't even call it non-suicidal self-injury at that point, that we now refer to as that does not include suicidal intent. And this, for families especially, becomes really important to me. For a minute, I'll tell you why in just a second. For purposes not socially sanctioned is because we do not include tattooing and piercing as part of it because it's undertaken for aesthetic purposes or a part of group membership. I will say, however, that research that measures tattooing and piercing next to self-injury does suggest that a lot of tattooing and piercing may serve some overlapping function. We'll talk about that a little bit later too. Without suicidal intent is what I just mentioned, and that's because, as I said, it's very clear there is a phenomenon that when people hurt themselves, and it can look and feel like a suicide gesture, but it's really undertaken to feel better. That separation is really important when you're talking with parents, because when you can help parents understand that this comes from a psychologically and developmentally healthy place, desire to feel better, you can work with that. That desire to feel better is good. The pathway to getting there needs to be modified eventually, but that the origin is not the same as wanting to end life. That becomes really, really important, and that becomes important too when you're doing assessment of intent. Not all self-injury is the same. So there are buckets. I'm going to be talking primarily about the common types today, but we do know, for example, that there's major NSSI that's associated with psychosis. There's stereotypic NSSI that's also associated with other disabilities like headbanging, probably similar function neurologically speaking, but not part of what we think of as the common forms, which are the ones you're more likely to be seeing in non-clinical populations and obviously some clinical populations too. So these can be compulsive. They're almost always episodic. I'll talk about that really quickly in a few minutes. And they can be repetitive so that they become part of a ritualized set of activities that somebody will do in order to feel better. There is an experimenter or follower group that tends to begin as part of the common or episodic group that can become part of the repetitive group over time. We see this in schools. So that's where there's one friend who self-injures as their dominant coping technique, and then they have friends who kind of think they're cool and maybe they're gonna, they want to sort of try it out too, and it becomes a part of group membership. But that follower group didn't adopt it as their primary means of self-injury until it was sort of adopted as part of this social element too. So that does create a slightly different psychological profile depending on when you get to them, because it can become their dominant method if they continue to use it. Self-injury is part of the self-harm continuum. So even though we parsed it out early on to study this discrete phenomenon, NSSI, it is clearly part of something much bigger. So you can think of that in these terms. It's like the large, it's the indirect types that we're all familiar with, any kind of unhealthy risk-taking, substance use, disordered eating, things that are going to affect the body and that are harming the self but aren't specifically directed at the body. And when you get into the more direct types, we're talking about, non-suicidal self-injury in which you are cutting the body or burning the body or doing something to actively invoke physical pain. And then all the way up to suicidality, where the goal is obviously to completely damage the body to the point that it no longer functions. So one of the big take-homes, and for most of you who work in the field, you would know this, one of the first things to do if you've got a client who's self-injuring is to try to figure out what other constellation of self-harming behaviors are going on. Because in general, as you all know, the more that they've got going on in this constellation of stuff, the more complex the case is going to be. And it may very well be that self-injury, the NSSI, won't be the first target, the first therapeutic target. It's actually probably, and if somebody's been injuring for a while and they know exactly what they can and can't do in order to create the physical sensation they're after without totally damaging the body, there are other things that they might be doing in their lives, other forms of harm that are actually more dangerous more quickly. For example, some forms of disordered eating. So self-injury as a therapeutic target may actually be sort of lower on the list depending on what else is going on. So it is a good idea to have the whole landscape mapped out if you can get it. All right, let's talk a little bit about the epi. So in terms of how common it is, this is what the most recent meta-analysis found. So in early adolescents, 11 to 14, we're talking about ever self-injured, 18.9%, self-injured in the previous year, about 14%. In middle to late adolescents, as well as young adults, we have some similar patterns. Ever self-injured, about 25, 26%, and self-injured in the previous year, about 20%. I did one of the first epidemiological random representative, basically, I did one of the first strong designs, epidemiological designs back in 2006, 7, 8. We were looking at young adults. I was that's how this did not plan to be studying self-injury. Put it that way. It kind of entered my life in a kind of strange way in 2004, and I was like, I'll do a little study, and then here I am many years later, because the information was so needed, but also because it was very clear when we were doing the random representative samples that we had on the first 2 college campuses and then later 8 college campuses, that the prevalence rates were way higher than we expected. I think everybody was like, whoa, that is not what we expected. So we found ever self-injured at 17%, and in the previous year would have been closer to 10%. But that provides a bit of a marker for this data, because you can see there has been an increase in the prevalence. I'm sure none of us are ridiculously surprised given the state of the world. There's been an increase in pretty much every mental health challenge indicator that we have, but it is clear that the self-injury rates are increasing, as also evidenced by the number of you on this call. It is important to know that 25% of youth who self-injure typically do it once. They try it. They're like, don't want to do that. That category of young person is at higher risk for other forms of mental health challenges, including suicidality, even if they don't decide that self-injury is a good pathway for them for self-regulation. But that does mean that 75% of people who try self-injure, who self-injure once, are likely to do it more than once. And once it becomes habituated, it's really hard to walk away from, for reasons we'll talk about in a bit. Just real quickly, I wanted to I don't know how many of you are working with children, but when I started the research I did in 2006, we had a small number of people in our studies saying they started before the age of 12, but the downward drift is notable. So one of the populations we're really seeing an uptick in self-injury is in younger children. So we've started to study it and have found this. NSSI lifetime prevalence rates vary between 7 and 9% in children ages 6 to 12. 9% of children ages 9 to 10 reported current and or past self-injury in one very large study that happened not long ago. And 57% of secondary school teachers feel unknowledgeable. So most of our systems, the youth serving systems, don't have any clue what to do with this behavior and how to work with it. And in fact, a lot of the work I do right now as a consultant is working with school systems and other youth serving systems to help them come up with protocols and approaches and activities for working with their self-injurious students and families. Just quickly, who's at risk? We expected to find something similar to what we were seeing in disordered eating back when we started this research, and we really didn't find the same kind of patterns. There is no obvious link to socioeconomic status or race or ethnicity. Sometimes you get there is a slightly more Caucasian students or young people who identify self-injury as a form of coping, but all of those differences wash out in the models when we start looking at it analytically really quickly. And so SES, zero, not even close. There is a strong association, as I'm sure many of you know, with childhood trauma or prolonged stress. Trauma is one of those problematic words sometimes for reasons you probably all also know, but I do find that it isn't always an outgrowth of trauma or traumatic experiences per se. It can be just prolonged stress. And that stress, as much as, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, we want to anchor it in the family. Sometimes it's locatable there, sometimes it really isn't. So we need to be very thoughtful about asking the kinds of contextual questions that's going to help us understand the various vectors of perceived stress. That's another piece we'll talk about in a minute. The one demographic, or the two demographic variables that do seem to make a difference is higher rates among females compared to males. For a long time, the studies were really split. If there was a gender difference or sex difference rather, we would see it in females, but half of the studies would show no difference. At this point, it does look like when you do the meta-analysis, there is definitely a slightly higher rate if we're comparing girls to boys. 22% of teen girls reported engaging in self-injury compared to 14% of males. I will say, and I'm not sure, I think I say this in another slide, but there are some differences in the way that presents. And if I don't hit on it in the next slide or two, I will tell you what those are. But not as many as we think. The one big difference is that females are it's more likely to be known or seen or detected. So you may be seeing a much higher rate of females in your practices than you see males, but that doesn't mean that males aren't doing it. It means it's not being picked up and they're not in therapy. That is very common. We see a significantly higher rate among LGBTQ plus and transgender youth. So in our studies, and this has been consistent across a bunch of other studies too, we had 47% of females identifying as bisexual also had self-injury experience. It doesn't look like gay or lesbian teens aren't at much higher risk than teens identifying as straight. There's really hardly any difference there, if any at all. But it's in the middle of the scale, whether it's a Kinsian question we ask, who are you sexually attracted to or aroused by, or whether we ask them to self-identify. And it does seem to be more female than male in the middle of the scale, but anybody in the middle of the scale is at higher risk. And then the more recent studies on transgender youth are not surprisingly showing much higher rates too among that population. So there does seem to be a sexual identity and orientation component for some people. So also something to keep in mind. In terms of what we see, what's self-injury, this is one of 3 pages I could show you. I'm not going to show you 3 pages. There's lots and lots of things that people do to self-injure. These are the things that most commonly come out in the studies that we do and others do in this order. So cutting and severely scratching are really at the top of the list. Banging and punching objects to the point of bruising or bleeding or oneself. But those questions are asked with overt intention of hurting yourself. So it is clear that they know that what they're doing is intended to hurt their own body. And this, not surprisingly, is a little more common among males than females. So they will punch or punch an object or get in a fight. They know that what they want is the physical pain. It looks like external focused aggression, and of course it is, but there's an internal focus component we very rarely assess for or see. And that ends up becoming very important because it's not uncommon that we find, some of the young men who are acting out in school campuses or so forth had a self-injury history beforehand that wasn't picked up as self-injury because it looks like this. It also means they're more likely to have wounds on their knuckles and hands. Biting, severely ripping or tearing skin. That's usually cuticles or in the mouth where you can chew on the insides of the mouth. Intentionally preventing wounds from healing. Not a little bit. Everybody picks once in a while at a scab. This is where you pick so much that it spreads. It actually doesn't heal. It just spreads more. Burning or embedding sharp objects under the skin. These are the most common. Embedding isn't crazy common, but in terms of the order of prevalence, these are the most common. But the reality is, as everybody can imagine, there are lots of things that people can do to self-injure them, to hurt themselves. This is one of the reasons why one of the dominant messages I usually give to parents is it is futile and probably counter-effective to run around your house trying to get rid of anything that's sharp. Because literally the sharp side of a table, a pencil, a staple. There's so many things that you can use to hurt yourself. Your fingernails, if you want to do that. And it becomes a power struggle. And you really do want to help parents avoid the power struggles, because what they need to do is keep the doors open for communication and exchange. So common sense means restriction, good idea. If they're, just because, and it's too easy to reach for the implements in a room if you're triggered. But ideally, if you do this with parents, you help them find ways to do it by agreement and not by force, unless it's absolutely necessary. But trying to make sure that their house has no sharps in it, I would let that one go. The most common locations are reading from top to bottom and left to right. These are the most common, but the reality is that self-injury can happen anywhere in the body. In fact, there's not a place that is not affected. I will say, however, it is very common if you have a client who's injuring on their face or their neck or in their genitals, it's usually a sign of some of the more atypical self-injuries, and there may be psychosis at play. You really do need to do a wider psych assessment at that point. We don't tend to injure on faces. If it's genitals, then that would suggest a history of sexual abuse. Not always, but that is one of the places your mind should go. Little more. Average age of onset is 12 to 15, but it can be as young as 5 and occurs among older adults as well. I mean, recent study I saw showed some adults in the 60s and 70s as a later age of onset or self-injury. Function is very similar to what we're going to talk about here. It is almost always cyclical, meaning episodic, with days, weeks, months, or even years between episodes. This is one of the reasons it can leave parents and guardians feel like they're walking on eggshells, because they just never know when it's going to start again. Males often do use different methods to injure, and they are a little more likely to say they do it when they're drunk or high or as part of a group setting. So they'll ask someone else to hurt them, like, how long can you hold the flame underneath before I pull away, that kind of stuff. It may seem like a dare, it may seem like a part of a, bravado ritual, but they know that the physical pain is part of what they're using to make themselves feel better emotionally. Individuals with earlier age of onset do report more frequency, more methods, and more related hospital visits. And the more functions, the more reasons they have to self-injure, the more likely they are to not stop. So it gets to be this cycle that goes on and on. That's one of the reasons why early intervention is really helpful. Females are much more likely to seek support, as I referenced earlier, so you may be seeing them a lot more than males. That does not mean, though, that the prevalence rates are radically higher for females than males. And I didn't say this, about 25% of individuals who self-injure do report that they've done so more severely than intended at least once. This means that the most common thing I hear is they don't self-injure for a while. That's the cyclical part. They get super triggered. They kind of forget how deep that blade can go before it hits something that causes a lot of bleeding, for which they might need stitches or so forth. And they're in an agitated state, so they do it. Weirdly, the stomach seems to be a site where this happens more frequently than other places. I'm not sure why. And then they're in panic because now they're bleeding a lot, and they've got a big open wound, and they go into shame mode, and they will not get help. So only 6% of people who said that this has happened to them will seek will seek physical help from a doctor. Most often, not weirdly, but sadly, what they do is will try to figure out how to deal with it themselves. So they may go to the internet and, figure out how they can close the wound. And I've heard some just hair-raising stories about people using their mother's upholstery thread to sew themselves up without anesthesia. And then they end up with either secondary infections or just really bad scars. So takeaway for you all is, if you have a client who's self-injuring, please ask them if they've ever hurt themselves more severely than they intended, and what did they do? If so, do they have the knowledge, the first aid knowledge they need to take care of their wounds? And if it ever happens again, ideally, will they make some agreements about what would happen at that point? Because it could very well happen again. And there's just no reason for it to. And the secondary infection piece is really important. All right. So I said at the beginning, self-injury is not suicide. It's undertaken to manage feelings, to come back into a state of coherence, or to feel better, and not to end life. However, there is a relationship between self-injury and suicide. So that if you do have a client who's self-injuring, it should trigger suicide assessment periodically. So let me explain a little bit about this relationship. So we being me and colleagues, spent a lot of time in the early parts of the 2010s trying to figure out this relationship, because obviously, especially for your purposes as clinicians, it's super important. We want to know who's headed up that right branch of the tree. If they're self-injuring, what's their risk of suicide? What do we need to be doing to protect them from that? And if they're not, then where does this go? So in a nutshell, it looks like, I'm sorry, I'm not an artist. This is my rendering, so please forgive me, but at least to get the idea. The suicide and self-injury does share some sort of common fertile soil. And the things I have here, trauma, physiological sensitivity, exposure, and receptivity, are just examples of a number of things that they share, all of the things you would imagine. In fact, a lot of them, the maladaptive behaviors we all are working with clients around, share a lot of this fertile soil. So we were trying to figure out this question of what gives rise to NSSI as opposed to something else isn't easily answered. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that today, although I probably will reference a little bit, but we don't know exactly why NSSI versus other things. We do know that it can give rise to self-injury. It usually because it's some version of prolonged stress or distress coupled with I shouldn't say inadequate coping, because it's not inadequate. It's preference. They prefer self-injury. A lot of times people who've self-injured have tried other things. They just don't find it works as well. So that becomes part of your job, is helping them find things that they might be willing to at least try out. But this creates fertile soil for self-injury. And then the question becomes, how many people go along what branch of the tree? Our studies show over time that 35 to 40% move up that left branch of sort of resolution and healthy coping, meaning their lives they're fine. They mature, they get the help they need, they understand themselves, and they can parlay it actually into growth. Some of them will just continue using self-injury or something else. A lot of times they'll symptom switch. They go back and forth with eating disorders, for example, especially bulimia. And that's that middle, and they can go up that middle branch of the tree for decades. I mean, I get messages from people who are in their 40s who've been injuring for 20, 25 years. They're trying to stop. It's just really hard once it gets entrenched. And then that last group, or the last group we're going to talk about, is the folks who are suicidal at some point or another. I say that because about 60% of people who use NSSI may also be ideating at one form or another, or at one time or another. Did I say 60? No, it's not 60%. It's more like 30%. Sorry about that. But what you'll see is that there's a 35 to 40% over time who will become more deeply suicidal. And that's the right branch of the tree. And that is a pretty large number. So NSSI is a harbinger potentially of suicidality, which is why you really need to kind of keep checking in on it. And it doesn't lead to suicidality, though. That was one of the questions. Like, if you do this, is it going to go down that road? Is it part of what's contributing to it? And the answer is no. It doesn't look like it's making it more likely. It does, however, look like if somebody becomes suicidal, then the act of literally and figuratively sort of slicing through the personal taboo and social taboo of hurting your body is just easier. They've had practice hurting the body. It's not an easy thing to do otherwise. So it does lower inhibition because they know how to do that. They will almost never use the same method to self-injure that they would use to end their life, because they're different functions. And that is really interesting and important. But if they get to that point where they want to end life, then having practiced suicide or having practiced NSSI does make it a little bit easier to carry out the act. If we look, there's been a number of studies that are like, well, how do we predict whether somebody's moving up that ladder to suicidality. And these are the variables that come out of the number of studies that have been done. I highlighted the 3 that we find in our study because our study was a good study, and we had some really good data, and I had a large number, and I had put the whole freaking soup, what do they say? All the ingredients of the, not remembering the metaphor, but I put everything I could think of in this model. We had lots of data, and these are the 3 things that came out. Greater lifetime frequency, up to about 60 incidents. After somebody's injured more than 60 times in their life, the risk actually goes down. I think that's because they're in that middle branch of the tree. But up to about 60 or so, their risk of suicidality is increased. Hopelessness, that is key. That's key. If you have a client who's starting to use a lot of hopelessness, purposelessness, don't know why I'm here language, then the red flags need to go up, because that ends up showing up over and over as a primary indicator of moving from NSSI to suicide. And the one that really was interesting to me and not what I expected is this other one over here, sense of disconnectedness or poor relationship with guardians or parents. I say that because I was working with college students who had been out of the house for a while. And this question that we asked, and we asked them, like, who do you talk to when you're sad, anxious, or depressed? And it was just like, who do you confide in? And it was a whole list of a whole bunch of different kind of people, like 17 different buckets of people, different kinds of peers, different kinds of adults. And there was a really interesting pattern. The pattern was, if somebody said, had only the peer categories indicated, my friends at home, my friends online, my friends at school, whatever, their risk of moving to suicide from self-injury was exactly the same as if they said nobody. They confide in nobody. Friends are great, and we need them, and it's good to talk to peers, but they are rarely able to stop the the psychological architecture, the crises that are giving rise to self-injury. They can just kind of take the steam off every so often. As soon as you add an adult to the model, any adult, any category of adult, trained or not, their risk of moving to suicide goes down. That's good. But it was this bucket, it was the parental bucket, the guardian bucket that really jumped out. It was the one that conferred the most risk when absent, if they don't confide in guardians, and it conferred the most protection if it was present. So that was really, really important. And that's one of the reasons Elizabeth and I ended up writing our book. I didn't expect to be talking to parents, but they turn out to be really, really, really important in the healing process, even if they've contributed to the onset or maintenance of self-injury, which led to us as a field creating a different set of recommendations for schools. It's like we used to say, you may need to be judicious about how you get parents involved, and now we say you need to get them involved. And you may need to support them because they have their own stuff, obviously, but they really need to be involved as early as possible in a constructive way, because they're really elemental in the healing process. It's also associated with all these different things. I have a bibliography at the end. You can mine it, but these were a bunch of different studies, so I didn't try to put them all on here. But the substance abuse is a very high comorbidity, and disordered eating especially high. So you can see up to 60%, and it's primarily bulimia, largely because a lot of the immediate physiological sensory stimulus is the same. In terms of managing, it does happen, contagion does happen, especially in institutional settings like schools or inpatient units. It's just one of the things that really does happen. It's not an easy thing to deal with. This is the tip that, typically what we recommend: having agreements about limiting overt discussion or display of fresh wounds, focusing group sessions on underlying feelings and coping, not talking about self-injury specifically. If they start talking about what they do or how they do it or anything, you see the contagion go up quickly. And then if you can identify and engage sort of the person at the epicenter and appeal to their best self or their better angel, as Barry Walsh puts it, it can really help, because they can help you then help their friends understand why this is not a great path to go down. Not always possible, I understand that, but if you can, it's a good way to do it. And if you want more ideas, just reach out to me. Where this isn't really a talk on contagion, but these are the kinds of things we recommend in general. Just real quickly, it can become habitual in over a third of cases, making it hard to stop. I don't use the word addiction, but they end up looking a lot like people who would endorse addiction items and any other things. So it just makes it super hard to stop when they want to. So this titration, harm reduction models are going to probably come into play. You do sometimes injure as part of group membership, and about 25% of school staff reported in a study I did about a decade ago, surveyed, reported knowing that this is happening in school, and sometimes they'll share blades. Problematic. So if you are working in schools, it's just something to give them a heads up about. I think of NSSI as the canary in the coal mine in a way. They're just basically young people are beaconing to us how challenging it is to grow up. And of course, unfortunately, we're all part of creating worlds that are just making it harder for young people to grow up healthfully. So when we're struggling or when we're helping somebody who self-injures, we're usually helping them in a number of ways, not just one. And then, as I mentioned earlier, because of its ubiquity, how easy it is to self-injure, removing all implements is pretty much ineffective for especially in family settings. So this is inevitably something you will end up talking with people about. There are one of the info briefs that we have on our website is for families and helping them deal with power struggles. It's a good resource, so you can consider downloading. It's free, or pointing them that direction if you're having those conversations with them. And we also have stuff in our book about this. All right, really quickly, I just want to talk about function because it ends up being really important. There's a lot of factors, and we don't have time to go through all of them, so I'm just going to highlight a few. So that, we always look at context, behavioral patterns, cognition, and emotions. Whenever we're trying to figure out what leads to this, do the same thing with self-injury. We find lots of different things, but some key things. We know that exposure to NSSI as something that's effective is one of the reasons we've seen increasing rates over time. It's just become more available in the popular media, et cetera. That started in about the 90s. There's a whole interesting little riff I do on that. We don't have time here, but that is one of the things that's driving what we're seeing. Not the only thing, but one. And then the behavioral patterns and associations in terms of why self-injury as opposed to something else. We do see that people who endorse self-injury do tend to have tactile sensory preference, meaning one of the ways they receive information or they interact with the world in a preferred way is through the physical sensory apparatus. So that's true. And they have low aversion to blood. Blood doesn't bother them. In fact, for a lot of people, they'll say it is soothing because it reminds them that they're real. It sort of integrates them back into the biology of themselves. It's interesting. It's a different relationship than a lot of people have to blood. These two, the cognition and emotion, are where I think the most interesting pieces are here. A lot of people who self-injure do have a negative cognitive style. Adolescents do in general. It's like we're the most negatively skewed in adolescence as we ever are. Studies show that over and over. But they tend to have a pretty significant negative skew. And then the capacity, I say body objectification, but it's not just that. It's body as billboard, body as canvas for self-expression. There is something satisfying about using the body to communicate with the world, even if the world never sees it. So there's a willingness, and I think the rise of tattooing and piercing in the 90s probably paved the way for this, because that idea that you can express something about your core self and your emotional state on your body was, in my time, it was black lipstick. That's about as far as it went, but it's progressed from there. So this is a natural outgrowth of that in some ways. But how emotions are felt and processed is where it gets very interesting for me, because people who self-injure do tend to have high sensitivity, and when they are physiologically aroused or when they're psychologically aroused, then their sensitivity goes through the roof. They have low tolerance for negative emotion and an ambivalent relationship to positive emotion. This is interesting from a therapeutic perspective because what it looks like, and we always, we talk with people about what triggers and how to deal with negative emotion, and that's important. We need to be doing that. But people who self-injure, it's like if there's a whole continuum of human emotion, and down here's all the negative emotions, and then we have sort of the neutral ones, then we have the positive emotions. People who self-injure are really familiar with these down here, and maybe a little bit the neutral ones. That's kind of when they're at their best. Usually the self-injury is to get them to the neutral ones. but very not familiar with the positive ones. And usually the not familiar with the positive ones is because they resist them. So as it turns out, I think from a therapeutic perspective, one of the big implications is your clients need to allow themselves to feel good sometimes, and they will resist that. And then they're just in this pool of negative emotion all the time. And understandably, they don't want to be there. So, but they resist the positive emotion for all sorts of very usually good reasons. Like, it feels scary. If I let myself feel good, then I may, feel it'll be really awful when I feel bad. But you might say, somebody gave you a compliment. Can you just let it feel good for 2 minutes? It doesn't even have to be that long, but just help them practice feeling good. Because once they can experience the full span of human emotion, the need to self-injure tends to be reduced. So it does have some implications for how people work with them that are a little bit different than might otherwise be intuitive. And they do tend to often have low self-regard and low self-compassion. And the self-compassion component is turning out in the empirical studies to be really powerful driver, a really powerful intervention, more powerful than even DBT, even though that's the one that's most commonly used with good reason. But helping them cultivate self-compassion does seem to diminish risk in a whole bunch of different categories. And there's some really good self-compassion focused curricula out there, as you know now. These are protective factors. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I just want to make sure you had them. None of them are going to be all that surprising. These are protective factors for lots of things. I understand self-injury two dominant ways. One is you have a kid who's very perceptive. They are sensitive to energy and emotion. They pick it up, they generate it. They don't know what to do with it. So I always say with two parents, it's a gift in a way, much better than the opposite. They perceive, but they get a lot. And once it's in their body, they do feel it somatically more than the average person, and they don't want to feel it and they don't know what to do with it. So they need help learning how to work with all the information they're generating or receiving. And it's not always clean or non-distorted, but it's a lot. And then I also understand it as a bid for connection. Even if they're not injuring in a way that makes that obvious, or even if they rebuff connection, I think fundamentally it's a bid for connection to themselves, to others, to something greater than themselves. It's often a statement of, I don't feel agency in my world and I don't feel like I belong or fit somewhere. Okay, the rest of these we're not going to go through because I want to keep going, but you'll have them there. They're certainly not surprising. Okay, let's talk a little bit about function. How does it help? So when we ask people these are the 5 buckets that we get. And that first bucket, to regulate negative or no affect, basically to deal with feelings, is always present. Always present if somebody's, injured more than once or twice. So that's because that's one of the reasons why it has been, I should have mentioned this, self-injury is not in the current DSM as its own diagnosis, but it is in the category of potential clinical diagnoses that would separate it out from borderline, and it would have it be its own diagnosis. That it's in that category, that bucket of phenomenon in need of more research, and that's what's happening now. I suspect the next DSM will establish it as its own diagnosis, and one of the core criteria will be, is it used to regulate affect or no affect? So kids or young people or adults, anybody who feels that, again, they're very perceptive, they're feeling inundated, they're much more likely to somaticize all of that feeling. They experience it in their body in a really big way, and they don't want to feel bad. Understandable. So they will use it to self-regulate, and it works. It'll work really fast for reasons I'll touch on briefly in a minute. Or they feel dissociated. And the self-injury will help them come back into a state of association and integration really quickly, turns out. So that is the most common bucket. Also, social communication and belonging. Sometimes people will injure in places that are obvious. It makes it obvious to the world. That's a bid for connection. That's pretty obvious. That's not an uncommon thing, but it isn't as common as the first bucket. And then we also hear to punish themselves. Deterrence is so I don't end my life by suicide. Those are the two things we'll get there. Sensation seeking is interesting. This is responding to questions like to get a rush or surge of energy. And that isn't extraordinarily common. And well, I don't see anybody endorse that until they've injured over 6 times, which is kind of interesting. But once there's some, and I think that's because it's engaging the endogenous opioid system, which is one of the theory buckets for how it physiologically works. We may be seeing that there. So it engages the endogenous opioid system. They know that, and it is more likely to be endorsed by males than females, which is also kind of interesting. And then self-distraction is just, I think of it as narrative pause in a not very functional way. It is a mindfulness technique in the sense that they use it to bring themselves out of the future and out of the past. So they may be ruminating and they injure, and now all the attention is right here. And it's very agentic because they've taken all this amorphous energy, emotion, stuff that feels unwieldy and weird and whatever, and they've concretized it. They've decided what it's going to look like. They've basically bundled it and put it physically on the body. And in addition to basically creating the boundaries and the physical look of this amorphous cloud of emotion, they've also created something that they can experience healing in. So agentically, because you can watch the body heal it. It's very powerful from a symbolic perspective. I think it's one of the reasons why some people will talk about self-injury as their best friend. It's just something that helps them to take this unwieldy stuff, concretize it, give it form, give it voice, and pass through the healing process. So keep that in mind when you're working with them, because they're probably going to need some other way to do that, at least symbolically. So what the biological neurological studies tell us is really interesting, and I don't have a lot of time to go into lots of detail, but so I'm going to try to summarize it and hope that it makes sense. So what we know from the studies that we have so far is that people who self-injure have higher physiological reactivity to emotional stimulus. That's kind of what I was talking about before. They really do pick up a lot, and you see it registered in physiological assessments, including neurological scans. You can see it. Once so they go up higher in terms of stimulus than the average person, or the emotional response to, the physical response, the physiological response to emotional stimulus. They're just more aroused than the average person. And that once they're really aroused, they have a much harder time coming down the other side. So an average person might go up and they might be there for a minute and then they might kind of come down. Somebody who's self-injured is going to go up higher, and then once they're up there, they're going to have a harder time. It's just going to take time to come down. If they can live for 20 minutes, they can just live with the discomfort that they're feeling for 20 minutes or so, it typically will start coming down the other side. So that's just something for them to know once they're ready. The thing is that self-injury, for reasons I'll talk about in a second, will bring it down much faster, and that is part of what they're after. So once they're really up aroused, they have less physical pain perception. Physical pain perception isn't that different than the non-self-injurious person when they're not aroused. But once they're emotionally aroused, physical pain perception decreases. Now, because of what we've learned about how the brain processes emotional and physical perceptions, it helps us understand that there are two parts of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, and the anterior insula, the AI, that do two very different functions simultaneously. So my ACC and AI are telling me that my water bottle, it feels a little heavy. The water is still cool in here. It's not too hot. It's giving me information about the way, from my tactile senses, about what's happening. If we were all in a room together and I was looking at your faces, my ACC and AI, the very same networks, would be telling me what you think of me, what I think you think of me. It would be giving me both physical information and emotional information at the same time. So it turns out that when somebody's up here and they're aroused, if they make a physical cut, think of it as if you stubbed your toe. You've hurt your toe, you're like holding your toe. We've all had this happen. You're sitting down, you're like, damn. And after what? 3 minutes or so, 4 minutes, the acute physical pain will start to come down the other side, and now it's kind of a dull ache. Turns out, if you do that and you're emotionally aroused, then as the pain perception drops off the other side, we call it the pain offset, it pulls down the emotional pain perception at the same time. So it's basically they're yoked together. So somebody who's hyper aroused, self-injures, the pain drop off will actually pull down the emotion drop off at the same time because it's the same brain region. So it turns out there's some funny things, like if you're holding a warm glass of anything, when you meet somebody new, you're more likely to interpret that person as warm or kind because you're you're cross-pollinating two different kinds of information, the physical information as well, and the emotional perception of the other person. Pretty wild, right? When we started to get this was Franklin's work, Joe Franklin's work in 2013. I remember we were all in a conference and he presented it, and we all went, oh, oh, that makes so much sense. It also helps us understand why it gets so entrenched and it's so hard, because who wants to wait 20, 30 minutes to start, to have that emotional pain subside when you can just quickly make an injury and then have the whole thing drop off pretty quickly. So small decreases in physical pain intensity can equal big decreases in emotional pain perception. That is one of the reasons it works so well, and one of the reasons it's hard to walk away from. It's not that simple, and this isn't functional in spades for everybody, but it's a huge piece of it. I have this image here because touch does the same thing. So it's not always appropriate, obviously, for therapists to touch their clients, etc. But human touch, or not human touch, can be animal touch. Just touch, using the tactile capacity of our bodies to touch ourselves or someone else. I think this is one of the reasons girls play with each other's hair. It down regulates the ACC-AI very quickly. Animals putting their feet in the grass, using the tactile sense to soothe is a quick and easy way to achieve the same thing. So something you can work on with your clients. When we ask people why they stop, this is the kind of stuff they tell us. This is all studies that we did early on. It's qualitative and quantitative studies, but in general, we find natural developmental processes for teenagers do help. So one of the first questions I ask parents when I call them, or when they call me, because I do coach parents or guardians, is how old is your child? Because that tells me something about where they are in the neurological development process. And it's one of the reasons why the ages of onset are still between 12 and 15, because those are the times when the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, the emotion center of the brain, and the cognitive decision-making part of the brain, are sort of the farthest apart as they're ever going to be. They're further apart than they were when they were little, and they're further apart than they are later in that age group, or at that developmental stage. They don't really talk to each other. And when stimulus, well, they do, but not that much. But when stimulus comes in, emotional stimulus comes in, the amygdala basically shuts down communication with the prefrontal cortex and says, I'm in control, and off you go. And of course, they want to feel better. So self-injury is a very quick and easy way to do that. As they grow, as these brain systems become more integrated, what will happen is the prefrontal cortex will say, are you sure? Maybe this isn't a good idea. We don't need to do this right now. That communication channel reduces the intensity of it and increases the likelihood that they can accommodate other coping mechanisms and that kind of stuff. So we see this reflected in the data. People will say, basically, I matured. And what they mean is that. And they became better. They had more trial and error and just more human life experience. So these things can help. Not all of them need therapy. I do tell parents, however, or I shouldn't say need it, but it's not kind of irrelevant. Not all of them receive therapy and still can move along that healing trajectory. I tell parents, if your child is injuring pretty significantly, if this is their dominant coping mechanism, therapy is a really good idea, because usually there's an underlying architecture that needs to be questioned and restructured. So therapy really helps. But it usually leads to maturity, experiencing and making positive external changes in the world. Like, I broke up with the guy who was triggering me all the time, helpful. And then they develop more positive relationships. That's part of it. Sometimes they'll talk about how it becomes really hard to hide the scars, and they notice how much it hurts the people they love, and they don't want to hurt them anymore, and they don't actually want scars all over their body, because that creates problems later. How do you explain these? Sometimes people are having to explain scars for decades. Fortunately, they do fade. Another piece of advice for those of you working with parents is if they've got a child who's chronically self-injuring, As much as they don't want to have to think about the fact that relapse will happen, it's going to happen because you don't just stop. They don't just stop. The greatest indicator of recovery is whether or not somebody wants to recover. So I think I say this later, but if not, just in case, if you have a client who's self-injuring, I would ask them on a scale of 1 to 10 or whatever scale you want, how ready are you to stop injuring? And because if it's down pretty low, it's not having it as a target for intervention is not going to be very smart. You're going to be looking at harm reduction and helping to get them sort of motivational interviewing to kind of get them moved along. So, but yeah, the scars can become a real problem. And then the other thing they'll talk about is they connect with something larger than the self. The sense of growing spirituality or religious connection is often in the mix too when we're asking people what helps them stop. Oh, and sometimes, yeah, they just get really scared because they hurt themselves worse than intended. And they realize they could inadvertently in their own life. All right, let's talk a quick about detection, response, and treatment, and then we'll move on to families. So I have two, maybe three videos in here that are a little bit long. I can't remember this, but these are interviews that we did with people that I could access through my role at Cornell a number of years ago. So it is not a random representative sample of interviews. We had no budget. These were people who volunteered to talk with us. Just keep that in mind. But I do think, and the study was really about families within families, like what did your parents do or not do, and what could they've done differently, what advice would you give? So that's the backdrop to this, and I do think a lot of what we hear is pretty common regardless of who you are.
She came to me one night and basically told me she was cutting. This is emotional for me. So um, I didn't really even know what that was when she told me. I was real new to the whole thing. And from there, called everybody possible. When she first told me, I just wanted to cry. I could still cry now just thinking about it. I just was like, oh no, what do I do? Where do I go? I needed to talk to somebody right then, and it was at night, and I had to wait till the next day, and that was killing me. And even in the very beginning, that night I didn't even tell my husband. I was in such shock. I just didn't know what to do or where to turn. But my pediatrician was the first one.
They just kept on pushing the topic. They're like, we're not going to leave until you show us your arm. So I showed it to them. And my mom immediately started crying. And my dad was like, why the hell are you doing this? So the way they brought it up, I don't think the best way. It's embarrassing to show your parents that you're hurting yourself. And you don't want them to think it's their fault, because that's pretty much what my parents think. And I'm sure a lot of parents might think my child's hurting themselves, it's my fault. And it's not.
My dad made basically, I think, every possible mistake you could make with a child who said that they self-injured. Uh, First, he minimized it and said, "Oh, everybody feels this way at some point. It's not a big deal." He not only minimized it, he judged it and said, um, you know, uh, made it sound like that's something that young people did, and it was stupid, and you should be more mature and not do that. Um, and then not only did he um, minimize it and judge it, the behavior, but he took the whole focus away from me. And he basically gave me the impression it was something that I was going to grow out of, and should grow out of, and should do it now. Um,
I don't think that they really took the time to think about what they were saying, or how I would react, because I think that they were just scared. I think they were panicked. I reacted equally strongly because of that. I felt very cornered. I felt very confronted, and because of that, I sort of backpedaled and lied, and you know tried to wriggle my way out of it rather than having an open conversation, because I felt very taken off guard. I think it would have been better if they asked me more questions about what I was thinking and feeling leading up to when I would cut or do something like that, because the bigger problem was that I didn't know how to deal with the emotions that I was having. And the cutting was just a manifestation of that feeling of being lost and confused and hurt and trying to find a place to put that. And I think that more dialogue about the thoughts and feelings behind that would have contributed to more long-term understanding of how I needed to better deal with my emotions.
I felt awful. I felt that I had tried to reach out. I had tried to be brave. I had tried um, to seek help. I had tried um, to open a door, uh, and that it had been slammed in my face. Um, and that, in a way, my greatest fears were true, which is that there was no help to be found in my parents, that there was nowhere to turn. I was inside, I was really hurt, but I was also really numb. And after the conversation, I self-injured.
I had this significant scar here, and when it's new, I think I was 18 or 17 years old. My mom saw this, but she turned her eye away immediately. It seems this injury hurt her a lot, but she didn't. She had never talked to me about that.
The conversation in the bathroom with my mother was more effective than the initial conversation I had had with both of my parents for a couple of reasons. First, it wasn't as confrontational. It wasn't in an open space in the house with both of my parents there and both of my siblings upstairs where I felt very exposed. It was sort of in a more private corner of the house, and it was just me and my mother behind a closed door, and in that sense, it felt safe. It wasn't as intimidating to talk to just my mother in a space like that versus talking to both of my parents in an open space with my siblings nearby. Because I didn't feel as panicked about being exposed. I could just be a little girl with her mother rather than a teenager trying to assert her independence in the context of the whole family in the whole house. And so in that sense, I think that she gave me an opportunity to open myself up more safely to her. And the other positive thing that she did that I think helped was that I don't remember her exact wording, but it was something along the lines of, I'm really sorry that this seems to show that I'm not trusting you, and I don't want you to think that I think you're a liar, because I don't think that's in your nature, but I can understand why you would not tell the truth about something like this, and I need confirmation. And so she was very careful to not accuse me of being a dishonest person or a bad daughter or anything that I was scared of her actually thinking. She was very much careful to confirm that she loved me, and she knew I was an honest person, and she understood why I would hide something like this. But that we need to talk about it honestly, regardless of all of that, and that she wasn't going to get angry.
And I don't think people have to accept the behavior, but I think that they still have to accept the person. And I think that's a fine line. I think that that's a question that parents probably have, is how do you make sure you're not condoning the behavior and also not judging the person. And, and I think that the answer to that is focusing on the feelings.
I was shocked, just shocked, and didn't know really what to say. I let her talk, and as a parent, I've learned that sometime when they tell you something that you're totally shocked about, just kind of keep a stone face and let them talk. And the more you do that and don't react, the more they will talk. And I just told her, we're going to get help. I'm here for you. And I just kept reassuring, if you ever need to talk, I'm here for you. So
I felt really relieved. I think I felt like relieved
sadness. I felt like, what am I doing? Oh my God, what's going to happen next? What is she going to think of me? What is my dad going to think? What are my sisters going to think? Am I ruining something here in my house? Am I infecting my sisters and am I a bad influence? Um, Lots of things like, who am I? Like, what's going on here? But I think that I felt just like this huge like release, like all this sadness just I could get out, and like it was another step.
You'll hear more from them. What someone might notice, I mean, these are all things that that are pretty common sense, but I do put them here because, oh, thank you for the heart. I do put them here because it's sometimes parents need validation, they need to know what to look for. So these are the things, it's usually change in demeanor, habits, or mood states. So it's, is your child different? And especially if you're noticing a change as well as some of these other physical indicators. So there could be fresh cuts, bruises, burns, other signs of physical damage. One of the things we see is constant use of wristbands or unexplained clustered or marks. That's something that parents often have a question about. People usually self-injure in batches. So it may be like they make multiple hatch marks, for example. Sometimes it's a symbol. Sometimes, asking for you as a therapist, and certainly you can encourage parents to do the same thing if if the communication lines are open. But one of the questions that's interesting to ask is, do any of your wounds have a story? Because they often do. There's often a story linked to one or more of the different specific wound sites. So those are interesting things to assess and important things therapeutically to assess. They might also notice unexplained paraphernalia. As I was saying, constant use of wristbands or bracelets. That's a little tricky because it's kind of, it's a look as well, but that's also a telltale sign. I think one of the biggest signs is inappropriate dress for season, meaning it's really, really hot and they won't wear short sleeves or shorts or anything like that, or unwillingness to participate in like swimming, things like that. Those are really common indicators of self-injury. I just put here, I know this is really focused on parents and I'm going to get to that. I just wanted to say, for those of you who are working in schools or in youth serving systems, please be sure they have a protocol that separates self-injury and suicide. It's really important. And we have some guidance on our website for this. It is one of the things I do the most with school districts, is help them to separate their protocols and then come up with how to do individual support plans and how to deal with the fact that self-injury is probably not going to stop, just because you figured it out. And then now they've got to figure out how to work with it in the institutional setting in a way that is likely to facilitate healing, not just make things worse. Because if you send kids to the ER every time they have a self-injury incident, you're probably just reinforcing a lot of the psychological reasons they have for going to self-injury in the first place. So it should be a separate protocol. In terms of just sort of advice that we give institutions, and it's advice that's good just in general, is with self-injury, and you heard it in the interviews that we just heard. It's really, we need to focus on feelings rather than the behavior. That's tricky for institutions that have liability issues. I know that's one of the things we end up talking a lot about, but in general, the protocols and the approach, whether it's in a family or in a school or in your office, should focus on feelings rather than the behavior itself. Remaining calm and dispassionate, using calm tones when talking. People who self-injure are very perceptive, remember. They may not be rendering what they're getting in a very accurate way. It's probably going to have a negative skew. But if they pick up judgmental tones and intent really fast. So when I'm working with schools, I'm like, before you have any conversation, you got to center yourself, get calm, and try to use a tone and an approach that is calm and dispassionate. It doesn't betray a lot of emotion, because if it's there, they're going to feel it. And if the emotion is at all negative, they're going to feel it, and it can shut them down, and it can shut them down for a really long time. Same thing with parents. If they're going to have conversations, work with the parents to get them, to help them get in a good space inside themselves before they start the conversation. Because as you heard in the interview, and it probably comes up again in the subsequent interviews, it really makes a big difference. And those first conversations can make all the difference in the world about what happens next. Help them use iMessages whenever possible. And there's lots of ways to be authentic and, express, as we know, as a parent or as a school system, without having to depart from this basic principle. And it really is effective. Invite whenever possible rather than demand. I work with school systems to help them come up with protocols that are collaborative whenever possible. Sometimes they'll have to be a demand because it's just one of those non-negotiables, but that should be rare. And helping them come up with approaches that feel like invitations and are more collaborative than not is really important. And then use respectful curiosity, which I'll talk about in a second. And then, especially for school systems or any kind of institutional system, be clear and honest about what has to happen next. And whenever it's possible to provide choices, do. So, for example, it may be you have to call a parent. The parent has to be called, notified. Would you like to call your parent, or would you prefer that I do it? Or would you prefer I do it versus, or another one of the staff members you're really close to and that has been trained or something like that. But whenever there's choices, please provide them, and also be honest about what happens next. A lot of people who self-injure don't feel like they're in control of their world for one reason or another, in ways that are very deeply disturbing. So wherever we can provide agency and transparency, it's helpful. It becomes part of the healing agent. All right, respectful curiosity is a concept that was coined by, I think her first name was Kelly Kettlewell. But she wrote a book about self-injury a while ago, several decades ago, and she coined this term. And it got picked up by Barry Walsh, who was a treatment specialist, and then the rest of us in the community, and I love it. When I was first really digging into this, I was a parent of young teens, and it became my parenting philosophy, and it did save me a lot of grief. Because instead of going, what on earth were you thinking? I used respectful curiosity to good effect. So it has 4 central goals. It conveys fundamental respect for somebody's personhood. It expresses openness and authentic curiosity. It solicits potentially really important information, and it invites self-reflection. So these are just questions. It's like the content of the question is less important than the way that it's asked. And I feel like probably most of you listening probably know this already. But if you're working with systems, a lot of times they don't know this, and they really appreciate having some basic principles around how do you ask good questions in a way that opens people up and doesn't shut them down. So these are just some examples. Can you help me understand what's happening inside for you right now? That STEM, can you help me understand, is a really, really good respectful curiosity STEM. Can you help me understand how it feels when? Can you help me understand? Because you're basically saying you're the expert on you. I'm not, but I really do want to understand. The meta communication is I care. It's not too much for me, and you're important and valued. So as long as that is conveyed in the question type, then they'll get it. So the can you help me understand is a really good, nice one. How can I best support you positions the young person as the expert again, and asks them to provide mastery, their own mastery. They can give you information about them. They really like that. It often helps. And then questions like, when you don't self-injure, when you successfully resisted self-injuring, how did you do that? What happened? Or what helps you feel balanced? They may never have thought about it. In fact, a lot of the questions you might ask them, they may never have thought about. So there's a way in which a lot of these questions can help them reflect in ways that benefit them in the long run. By answering you. The other technique that, and I'm sure most of you know this, but that I find works really well with young people, and it isn't just around self-injury, it can be about anything, is on a scale of 1 to 5 or 10. I often use 10. On a scale of 1 to 10, how overwhelming was that feeling when you had it? That can, and then my kids would happily give me a number where they would not answer my question. And then I could say, why did you answer 7? Or why did you answer a 4? And then they will usually follow up. So I find the scaled entries to some of these questions can also be really effective. Unhelpful approaches, as everybody knows, judging or shaming, making demands, lecturing, harsh punishments, invasions of privacy. That includes, body scans and searches. making ultimatums. And we really want to avoid statements like what we heard in the video, why are you doing this? This is crazy. You're being selfish, or over identifying. I know exactly how you feel. That's not possible. So I can, you can use empathy. I can imagine that feels really hard. Those kinds of statements are sometimes very similar to each other, but they convey very different things to people who have very subtle sensing. So you may need to be working with some of your families to help them sort of refine the way that they talk about things and the way they ask questions. This is from CIRA. So I love CIRA there. It's a self-injury and recovery awareness. It's an organization that is run by youth or now it's young adults with lived experience. I'm on their board. I really appreciate what they do. They don't have a lot of money for evaluation, but I think that the group programs that they're running are probably pretty effective based on what I know. I asked them to give advice for us, for the people I worked with, and here's what they said. Don't overreact, assume fragility. Focus on the person rather than the behavior. Focus on strengths rather than limitations. Give them a you matter roadmap of what they can expect. I mean, this is for systems we were asking about. So tell them, we ended up for one school district creating literally, it looked like a roadmap. So here's what will happen first, second, and third, and here's what you can expect. They really like knowing what's going to happen. And invite rather than demand, and ask rather than assume. So this is from the lived experience perspective advice. Oh, and know that it takes time, patience, and strength to heal, they said. All of them describe journeys. It wasn't as though they got found out by their parent or the school system and, oops, I'm in trouble and I'm going to stop. Did not happen. It really is a journey into recovery, and partly because it's a journey into themselves, as you'll hear in one of the closing videos. They learn a lot about themselves as they're sort of traversing all the experiences that this brings, and they come out different. So it's not like they're healing or recovering as though they're going back to some former state. They're actually growing through and growing sometimes as a result of. We'll talk about that in a bit. And then lastly, link questions to education opportunities. This is one of the things we suggest for schools. It can be that you can have questions about what led to the self-injury incident that now has them in the nurse's office, but you can also say, I have information about why self-injury helps and why it's challenging. Would you like to see it? A lot of people self-injure don't know why they self-injure. They don't know. They know it helps them feel better, but they don't know why. They don't know any of the information I gave to you. I get emails from people who come to my website who are self-injuring and are trying to understand themselves. So helping them understand themselves by having literature on hand or having resources on hand is really helpful. I know that finding other ways feeling can be challenging. There are some other strategies to work that work. Do you want to help? Do you want to work together on exploring some of these? Can I share some of what I've learned? Those are just ways to augment their understanding and capacity for reflection. All right, let's talk about supporting caregivers. What do we got here? Okay. So there is a link between self-injury and parenting, that we do see that. These are some of the things we found. I will say, having worked on a number of studies and with parents, that is not always the case. There have been multiple families in which they seem to have done everything right. They're not emotionally cold. The family's relatable. I mean, all the stuff. And their child still ends up self-injuring. So it isn't always a result of what a family's doing. I think we have to be very careful not to assume that. And we also need to be careful not to assume widespread dysfunction in the family. It's just, there's a whole mix of things that seem to go into why somebody self-injures, and it's not just vectored in the family unit. We have a much broader set of contexts here that feed people stress. So don't make assumptions, but do understand that there, statistically speaking, we do see some issues related to negative inability to express emotions, or just expressing negative emotions, or controlling parent behaviors. Unfortunately, once self-injury starts and the family dynamic starts, it actually can decrease emotional support. It can increase even more rigid parenting styles. Parents are trying to control it and stop it and all that sort of stuff. And there can be more rules, more bids for increased connection that are not very functional, and then it gets worse, not better. This is some of the dynamic that you might end up having to kind of help parents understand how to stop. But it is just, parent just, it's very stressful to watch a child that you love or injure their body. I mean, it really does cause these visceral responses. So we really want to be empathetic, but a lot of the natural, like constricting responses are not functional in at the parent level for this behavior. I don't know if it's functional for any behavior, but it's definitely not for this one. And then we know that depression is often a core mediator between parental conflict and NSSI. So often students, young people are not just dealing with one thing. Obviously, there's a number of different kind of related comorbidities. Caregivers do experience unique challenges, as we found when we studied them. That's because self-injury is chronic but silent. It's not socially visible. It's not like the world knows, you know, their child has some challenge and they get accommodation for that. It often occurs within the context of normal development. Child is going along just as expected. They're part of normal peer groups, and then this hits, and now the parent feels isolated and strange and maybe like a social pariah. And a huge number, I think this is changing a little bit, but I would say when I was first working with parents back in, say, 2010s and beyond, there were lots of parents who said they didn't tell anybody. They were ashamed to tell anybody in their family. They weren't getting therapy. So they were trying to hold this totally on their own. Sometimes their spouse wouldn't know if they were married because they were afraid of what their response was going to be to the child. And it's a lot to hold. So the second question I ask people, first question is, how old is your child? Second is, do you have support? Are you in your own therapy? Do you have people you're talking to? Because if it's a case where somebody self-injures as their primary means of feeling better, the parent is going to need support because it's probably going to go on for a while and take a while to resolve. So, and then the fact that it's episodic just can make them feel like they're walking on eggshells all the time. So they're afraid that anything they do or say is going to trigger an episode. And so then there's a lot of confusion about how do you parent and have expectations. And we address some of this in our book. I am not going to be able to address all that here. And there is no magic pill for this, but there are some common sense approaches that I'm sure many of you already are aware of. But if you've got parents who are really struggling, please do let them know our book is out there and we do address it in detail. Oh, we already did this. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm just going to go over this. Once it happens, parents often underestimate. So our studies suggest that parents often underestimate NSSI frequency, and most especially the forms used. 70% of young people who self-injure will use more than one form. And that's true for you guys. Need to know that too, because somebody might present, they might disclose that they're cutting or something, but chances are good that's not the only thing that they use. In a pinch, they'll use other things. So they may have a preferred method, it may be cutting, but that's probably not the only one. 70% of them have multiple ones. And often that's the information that is withheld from parents and therapists and others. So good thing to assess if you can. Parents often learn about self-injury after it started, and that means it can cause a mismatch in urgency. So it's not funny, but it is interesting that a lot of, the child may have been injuring for a couple of years before the child, or certainly months usually, before the parent finds out. And the child's pretty copacetic with it all. They just, it's become a part of their ritual. And the parent now is like, oh my God, this is horrible. We have to stop it right now. There is the sense of urgency, and the emotional charge around it can be very different, and that can cause problems in communication. Reaction disclosure is important. It will open or close doors to communication. So that working with them on that is super important. And for parents, the tension between wanting to connect and wanting to control and stop the injury can cause confusion and conflict. But overall, the experience can increase connection and cohesion. We do find that in our studies, about a third of families who experienced this with their family ended up saying that it helped them grow as a family. So that's interesting, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So it's just important to know that self-injury stems from a normal desire to feel better. I said this before, it is really an important communication to parents. Your child there's nothing fundamentally wrong. In fact, it's fundamentally right. They want to feel better. They just haven't figured out a good way to do that. And they get a lot of information and they somaticize it. So now let's figure out what's going to be a viable pathway. People who self-injure are often highly perceptive, but struggle with ways to understand and discharge emotion. They need to avoid power struggles whenever possible. Easier said than done, I know, but that is really a big goal. And it may require time for the behavior to stop. So paying attention to the more subtle shifts can help. And we talk a lot about this in the book and give them some tools for doing that. And I recommend you help them with that too. don't look at the behavior right away. Look at how they're framing emotion. Look at how fat do they pull back from the edge where they might have gone over and you guys might have had a big fight. You know, things, just the subtle things that are likely to change before the behavior change is what you can help them pay attention to so they feel like they're seeing signs of progress. All right, when caregivers are resistant, so these I'm going to share from Matthew Seligman's chapter in the Oxford Handbook on Non-Suicidal Self-Injury that was released just a little bit ago. I love this chapter. We'll happily send it to you if you don't want to buy the whole handbook. It's pretty big, so just reach out to me. But he has some great tips for therapists around this, and he has a number of books using collaborative strength-based therapy for dealing with self-harm and other kinds of things. So I really recommend Matthew's work. So here's just some tips he gave us. Practice partiality by validating all family members' perspectives, especially resistant parents who may feel blamed or criticized by other professionals. This is some text that he's something like what he suggests. So, you know, you can identify. He's just basically validating their experience and showing that he can empathize with it, and then inviting them to comment on it. It's one of the ways he gets therapeutic alliance with difficult families. He has a lot of experience working with difficult families. He has techniques for providing emotional safety by, for example, at individual check-in time, you know, I'm wondering if it might be helpful for us to have a brief conversation just between the two of us before bringing people back so I can get a clear sense of what you've been experiencing or how you think of this. Or normalizing difficult emotions. When I work with families dealing with self-injury, parents sometimes share complex feelings that they're hesitant to admit. These reactions don't reflect on your parenting. They're just part of being human. I'm curious about what emotions have been most difficult. So this is a theme throughout everything that he suggests. And he based on my work with him, Matthew and I have been friends for a long time. It's pretty obvious that they're very effective at pulling out the parents that are often the most defensive. And I'll tell you, I mean, I'm sure you've noticed some of the reactions of self-injury can go, I mean, usually there's grief, guilt. I mean, there's an automatic, that happens automatically for most parents. It's what did we do? Where do we go wrong? Was this because of the divorce? I mean, they immediately, they're looking for the reason, and they're feeling all the feelings that come with that: shame, guilt, remorse. And then for some parents, as you probably know, that goes right into anger. It goes just right into anger. You know, they don't even know that they're having these other feelings. So sometimes it takes a while to kind of unpack that with them so that they understand their own fear. That's why I suggest they have somebody to work with. And then really to help them not project that onto the child right away. So anyway, he does a nice job of speaking to the potentially wounded, scared, very grief-stricken, feeling victimized and misunderstood parent. Sometimes use good engagement strategies, using things like pessimistic questioning that validates the struggles while uncovering exceptions to the problems. So he'll say something like, given all the challenges you've described, I'm curious what's keeping the situation from deteriorating further. During those really tough moments when nothing else seems to be working, what helps you continue to support your child instead of throwing in the towel? With everything that's happening, how are you managing to keep this difficulty from taking over every aspect of your life? He also helps parents to recognize when they're emotionally reactive. So, and you teach alternative responses. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how emotionally triggered do you typically feel when you discover your daughter's been cutting? And then you can go into a conversation of how do you respond to that? How do you work with those feelings you have? I would say something like, I imagine if your daughter's very perceptive of emotions, you probably are too. But you know, what's your experience been working or growing up with that kind of sensitivity? What are the first physical signs you notice in yourself that you're about to react strongly? And what have you found helps you maintain your center? So all of these things function like the respectfully curious questions we were talking about earlier, where it prompts their own self-reflection. There are more examples, and as I said, I would advise you to consult his work if you want a comprehensive sense or some ideas about how to work with difficult to work with parents. Right, another video.
I want her to ask first. I don't want to tell her that I cut myself or hurt myself. I want her to notice that, and I want her to ask why you do so. Actually, that's really what I want her to ask, why you do so. I want to tell her why. Don't be afraid. You are the parents. You should take the responsibility.
I think that there's a false concern that you shouldn't reward attention-seeking behavior, or you shouldn't reward negative behavior, or you shouldn't acknowledge negative behavior. And that somehow, if you acknowledge self-injury, or if you bring the topic up, somehow you'll cause it, or somehow you'll make it happen if it wasn't already happening, or you'll make it happen more, or that you will give the impression it's okay. And so that it's somehow better not to talk about. And frankly, I think that that's cowardice.
Like for a parent, like any chance that their kid wants to talk to them, jump on that. In a gentle way.
It's totally understandable you don't want to talk to your child about self-injury. You still have to find a way. So you need to seek help. You don't know what to say. You don't know how to say it. You don't know when. Seek help.
I would say get professional help as fast as you can, because I would have to believe I'm not that different than the average person, and that I didn't understand it existed. And any approach I would try without any knowledge, I don't believe would be effective.
If I could redo it, I think maybe I would have tried to approach her earlier. I did see the signs of depression. I didn't know she was cutting or anything. I didn't even really know what that was. I think I would have tried to approach her earlier, even though she was pretty unapproachable at that point.
Don't be angry. Don't be afraid. And don't think that's stupid.
Telling them not to do it anymore, to just stop, is not the way to go. It's going to take time, it's going to take counseling, that sort of thing, and to be ready for that. And to just not tell them they have to stop or something else is going to happen.
Make them feel bad about anything because they know they're doing bad things and they know it's not good for them and they don't need anybody else saying like bad, making them feel worse.
I think the two primary messages to give are, I'm sorry you feel that way. Wow, I can see you feel really badly. And I'm really glad you told me. And then follow up with, and let's do something about it. Let's find a way for you not to feel this bad.
She laid with me in my bed for a long time. And like after a while, she went to her bed after I had fallen asleep. And I just remember her coming back into my room later that night. And she said, when you hurt, I hurt. And for me, that was like, she really cares. And I'm not alone. So it was big. That conversation was very emotional. We both cried, we hugged, we cried. There were points I didn't know what to say. And then I don't think she didn't either, but I think at that point, there was hope she was going to get some help.
They stayed in the room. They didn't run away. They didn't say they hated me. They gave me a hug. They gave me a kiss. They sort of, I don't want to say accepted, that's not the right word, but they were there for me. They didn't shy away now that they knew that I was a cutter.
I just told her I was always there for her, and you know, no matter what she needed, I was going to get help for her.
That one thing I would say to parents of children that self-injure is don't underestimate the power of what you say. What you say will live with your child forever. It will be an important message over and above other messages that you gave your child. You can always come back to that conversation and say, we talked about X, and I'm worried that I may have made it sound like I thought you were bad, or I thought that it wasn't important, or whatever it is that you'd like to readdress, and say, that's not the message I really want to give you. And the reason why I said that was because I was um, upset or frightened by how bad you felt. But I'm strong enough to take it, and I've given it some thought, and this is the message I'd like to give you.
Okay. I really like this because there's some key things in there that come out over and over again. And one is, I think, for parents and professionals, all of us, is that the meta narrative, the meta message always really needs to be, we care, we're sorry you hurt, and we want to help. If parents can convey that, even if they mess it up sometimes, even if they have their own strong reactions and go back and say, really didn't mean to have that reaction. I'm having a reaction, honey. It scares me. What I really want you to know is we care. It's not too big for us because a lot of kids feel like they need to protect their parents, especially from something like this, because they know instinctively it's really going to scare them. If they can convey it's not too much for us, we love you. We're gonna go get help. That really does help. The other thing that came up there is the expect relapse. It's not relapse. Expect that it's not going to just stop right away. So they just need to know how to manage that and how to be with that and how to negotiate, navigate around that, especially using, agreements and understandings and just being realistic. And motivational interviewing, if you could teach them some form of that, and harm reduction, it's good. They're going to have to deal with parent power struggles. We have, like I said, a lot of stuff on our website and in the book around how to work with that, because as soon as the power struggle gets in, then you start counteracting that we love you and want to help you kinds of message, and then it gets confusing for everybody. And then lastly, it's really good idea for you if you have parents, if you have a child who self-injures in your practice or anywhere, good to have some information on hand. You can just print stuff out from our website or other people's websites and have it and say, here's some basic information. They often don't know anything about self-injury, and it just is going to scare them. And they could use some understanding about what it is, how common it is. Your child is not way outside the norm. And, here's what it usually indicates. Here's why it works. That basic stuff. All right. Lastly, tools. Here's just some things I was hoping that you could use. Just basically, these are just messages for parents, all pretty common sense, but I'm just putting it in here because these are the things they really do need to know. One of the things I also emphasize when I'm working with parents is how you manage emotion is your role modeling for your child. So if you're in a conversation with them or about the self-injury, whatever, and you're feeling yourself get really agitated, you can leverage that and say, I'm feeling myself get really agitated. I think what I need to do is take a pause and go for a walk or breathe or meditate, whatever you do, take a pause. I want to come back and talk about it when I'm not feeling so emotionally charged. You're showing them how to vocalize emotion. You're being authentic, and that communication is part of the healing alchemy. And third, you're taking care of yourself and demonstrating what that looks like, and it'll be a much better conversation when you come back. Those are all. I was telling parents, you don't need to not be yourself. In fact, maybe be yourself a little more vocally, and just make sure you're using I statements. You're talking about you, not about them. And you're showing them how you deal with emotions when they come up, because that's part of what they're struggling with. They don't know what to do with all this big emotion. Show them by showing them, not just talking about it. Respecting individuality, they do have to set some boundaries. They may have to risk that self-injury will be a result. That's always a challenge. And then different ways that they can practice positive coping together as a family, or as a dyad, or whatever the constellation of family is. Oh, and avoiding overscheduling. Yeah. We don't want them just to be scheduling everybody to the hilt as a means of avoiding the stuff that they really need to be dealing with. Just understanding and building on family strengths, that there are a number of indices I'm sure most of you know about that you can use with families to help them figure out what they do really well already and how do you leverage that. Let's focus as much on that as, because their minds are going to go to how they're failing. You got to help them see there's places in which things are going really well, and how do you just use those to offset the places where there are challenges. I love this one. They can co-create toolkits that match sensory preferences, and I know I like. So you can have that category in the far left are all the different kinds of sensory input ways that people have, visual, auditory, tactile, etc. I always assume somebody who self-injures got the tactile sensory preferences pretty obvious for the most part, and so you may want to help them, like, what are some other things you might do that are tactile that you'd be willing to try in somewhat triggered but not highly triggered situations? Because one thing I hear from people who self-injure all the time is if they're really triggered, they're going to use self-injury. You got to practice when it's not, the trigger is maybe a little bit there, but not so triggering that they really need this to stop. So if they can, you guys, it's fun to create these possibilities, and then they can kind of do the SUD scale, like, how distressed were you before you tried the thing, and how distressed were you after? So they have some quantitative data on themselves. There's just lots of ways to make this interesting and fun for them. And all of us have multiple categories of sensory preference that we'd be willing to kind of play with. Urge charting is really helpful. How strong is your current desire? It can be 0 to 10, or it can be, 0 to 4, 0 to 4, 5, 10, doesn't matter, but how strong is the urge? And then and it becomes that if they can quantify it for themselves, you ask them for a while and then have them quantify it for themselves. It's very easy shorthand. First of all, someone can come through the door and they can say something, and you can say, well, how strong was the urge, or how strong was it? And they can, you guys automatically have an immediate shorthand. But it also normalizes self-assessment and self-reflection. And this is part of what you want to have become habitual. Can you start reflecting and noticing your own patterns, but not just the negative patterns? Notice the positive ones too. Diversion techniques are, like if we're trying to help people, all right, what do you do when you have the urge, you're way aroused? Diversion techniques can be helpful. Here's some of them. We all know them. Get on their phone, whatever. They are distraction skills that have a role and a place, but they are not the same as, some other kinds of skills that are going to actually help them downregulate. So I do usually make a distinction between those two, but there is a place and time for distraction. What they really are ultimately going to need are replacement skills training of some sort. And these are the buckets that we all in the field agree tend to be the most useful. But again, it's person specific. So going back to that, coping chart, it's like, can you come up with things together that they think are going to likely to help them, and then they can practice with it and they can do the SUDs, before or after. That kind of stuff gives them data. I always basically, it's like, you study you. I want to see you studying you, and you tell me what you've learned. And then because that process, I know that process is going to change them. Just the act of observing ourselves changes us. So we're teaching as much that process as we are, specific techniques. We do this is sorry about that. This is a readiness to change question that's part of a larger stages of change tool that we have on our website. And I put this separate because this 1 to 10 scale is really important. This is probably, I would propose, even though I haven't studied it, one of the single most important factors in determining how ready somebody is to do anything related to their self-injury. So if they're less than, like, I don't know, a 6, then you're looking at harm reduction. And I wouldn't even try to get them, you want harm reduction and motivational interviewing to kind of move them along, or track as they're moving along. But you're probably not going to want it as a therapeutic goal if they're really not ready. So these are some other areas that, so I have not psychometrically validated this, but this is based on the stuff that I noticed in our research and my experience with it. They needed to have all these different things. They needed to feel like they could visualize it. They needed to be able to know that they had full intent. They needed to know that they could be resolute. So these are all the stages of change that people tend to go through if we're looking at the spiral, the change spiral, in behavior change. So this tool is on our website, or you can just you can email me. Oh, so there it is on the website, and you can grab it, and it's useful for trying to map maybe where your client is to some degree. Trigger log. This is from Barry Walsh's book. I said it's forthcoming. Treating self-injury is not forthcoming. It's been out now for a while. I love this. Some version of this, and most of us would do. It's like, just here's what can you understand about your own patterns. It doesn't have to be this specific tool, but some tool like this is helpful, again, in them establishing their own pattern. But I love that Matthew adds this positive trigger log. So he'll also invite people to, well, when you were able to resist it, what happened? Like, who was around? Who was involved? How did it help? He also has an epiphany log. So it's not specific to self-injury. I had an epiphany about life. What was it? What was it sparked by? What did you learn? Because helping people to basically turn their gaze to what's working, to what makes them feel expanded and growth, is part of helping them move along that emotion gradient we were talking about earlier. They need, and it'll help them create it. We basically do create what we look at inside. So we don't want them to constantly be looking at the things that are going wrong, even though we want them to understand the patterns. We also really want them to look at when it works, what made it work, because you're reinforcing it. So I really loved these. Just in terms of resources, and we're down to the end where we can get some questions in. These are the two books that I referred to, are Barry Walsh's and Matthew's. Matthew has a number of books, and the two documents that I shared are from his chapter in our handbook. So as I said, you can ask me for that, and I can give you a PDF of the chapter. But I like a lot of his work, so you can check out all his full body of work. If you really want to dig in, here's our handbook. It's a beast, 60 chapters, very expensive, but it's good. And then here's my book, and this is the tool that we give parents around helping them to notice the subtle. Tell them that it's really important for them to do self-care. I cannot tell you how many parents I work with who are not attending to themselves at all. They're just so worried about their kid, and they're trying so much to get them into care, but they're really not working on their own. They really need that, partly because they're going to model how to do that. And then I'm almost done, I promise, Jackie. There is growth that does happen. We found that over a third of participants in our study indicated not only that they didn't just say, they said, we didn't want this and we are sad that we had to go through it, but we grew as humans. We grew as a family. It actually increased understanding. So one parent said, I learned so much about myself, my parenting style, my marriage, and my children because self-injury entered our lives. It's made me more introspective about what she needs from a parent. And another parent said, I can see now that she's very resilient and that she knows how to eventually reach out and accept help. She seems to be committed to a positive self-story. It all felt developmentally necessary, if challenging. This was not unusual. We have many more of these vignettes in our book because we basically drew all this, did the study and then wrote the book. So please let your parents know it's not like the worst thing that ever happened. In fact, you might grow and expand as a family, just because you have to get more real and raw and honest, and that is usually always good. Key takeaways: self-injury is a coping mechanism, not a failure. Your relationship matters most. Professional help can make a real big difference. This is for parents. Recovery is a process, not a moment. And hope and healing are not only possible, but probable. Okay, last video, and then we'll go into Q&A.
They will be always there. Remind you, her child.
People ask me about scars every day. They were pretty noticeable. Took them a very, 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 very long time to become less noticeable, and they will never be invisible. I will always have these scars.
I'm going into education, so I'm going into the teaching field. And I think that a positive thing for me, I mean, I'm sort of still in the cutting phase, but, I think that going through this, I can be a mentor to somebody else that is having the similar issues sort of approach it a little differently?
The one good thing I've been able to get out of it is that I had modeled for me, I think, almost everything you could do wrong in a situation like that. And so it's very clear to me how I want to behave differently as a parent. I'm a parent of a small child. And so I have really clear guidelines for me of what to do instead. And so I'm going to be a much better parent and no one can stop.
I'm thankful that I went through it. And I know that sounds kind of crazy, but I'm thankful because I learned so much about myself and really how to like break down all those layers and find who it is I really am. And in the process, trying on 1,000 different masks and 1,000 different personalities and clothes and everything that comes along with it. But for me, it's like I was given a chance to love myself and to really prove that this life is worth it. And having gone through that and moving, it's like every step I take since then is like huge leaps, and it's just beautiful and fine. It's just where I am now is only because I went through all. So in a lot of ways, I needed to go through that, and it's terrible, and I would never do it again, or never want anybody to go through that. But I'm thankful for everything I had. I think that going through that has made this experience in my life 1,000 times better.
She has definitely become, I believe, an incredible person because of what she went through. She's very caring to people. She's more caring than the average person because she's been through it and she's understood or seen how, people don't care. So I mean, really and truly, the best thing that's come out of it is the person she's become.
I saw my daughter go from like all I can compare it to is like a cocoon, just totally wrapped up cocoon in dark into this beautiful butterfly. So good does come out.
Okay. Okay, we'll just move here. You guys will have all this in your slides and we can open it for Q&A. Jackie.
Oh my God, fantastic. Thank you so much, Janice. This was an incredible presentation. I feel like from what folks are saying in the chat as well, people really seem to have really valued this. We have a lot of questions. I know we're not going to have time to get to all of them. But I think I'll bring up a couple. We had a couple folks asking about the sort of intersection of self-harm with autism spectrum disorders or other developmental delays and sort of what that looks like and the implications for that.
Yeah, implications are tough to talk about. Intersection, absolutely. I mean, I remember when we were recruiting people to write for the Oxford Handbook, it was really hard to find someone who could write that chapter. There is a chapter there. And if you want it, contact me and I'll pull it over. In terms of implications, I mean, really in its infancy. I'm so sorry. I can't give you more. I will say that a lot of the function is, I think, the same. It's from a neurological perspective. I think it's probably activating the same neurological links, and it is an attempt to downregulate. So if we can understand it that way and give them other techniques, again, somatic, it could be tapping, it could be rubbing, it could be fabric, that may help. But work on the assumption that part of what they're doing is using physiological pain perception to downregulate the emotion, and see if you can find other tactile ways of helping them to do that. And it's got to function. It works.
I Also, we had a couple folks ask about sort of the role of like family history. Is there any sort of evidence that there's a family history to NSSI?
Definitely. Yeah, it does. I mean, we do see that is not uncommon. Like I remember in that study that we drew some of the quotes from, there were at least a couple families in there whose one of the parents had self-injured, and then the daughter started self-injured, not because of that, but there did seem to be some lineage component to it, maybe through depression. I don't think that's the dominant pathway, but it is a pathway. And we also see exposure to siblings and, sibling friends and self-injury as another vector for, not even thought about it, it becomes, available as an idea in a way that we see that in the 90s too. Part of what happened, 14 pop icons came out talking about their self-injury. They weren't advocating it, but they were talking about it, Rolling Stone or whatever, and they were big, Princess Di and Johnny Depp and stuff. So I think it just made it available for most people, like, huh. And then off it goes. So it becomes so you see something similar.
Oh, incredible. I mean, I know we are at time. I know that you have your email here. Would you like people there's a lot of people in the chat that were interested in getting the chapter from you. Would you like folks
Yes.
to reach out to you directly?
Yeah, either you reach out to either of us. You can send me, I can send it to you and give it to you. And then anybody, if you want to reach out to me directly, I'm happy to send the chapter to you.
So if folks who put in that in the chat, please reach out to Janice directly, or if you want to reach out to us at CTAC, we can forward your information on to her. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Janice. This was incredible, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Yeah, and if you have questions that you really wanted to get answered, just reach out to me directly and I'll do my best.
Thank you all.
All right, everyone. Bye.